shit. So coming back to what I mentioned a few moments ago, this idea of emerging adulthood. By your late teens, for the vast majority of people, a lot of the storm and stress and all the moodiness and risk-taking behavior and conflicts with parents have begun to decline. For some people, really significantly decline. They seem to have really evened out, for lack of a better term. And then for other people, they're still experiencing some of the storm and stress, but even if they are, it's nothing like they experienced a few years earlier. So you're not an adult, you're an emerging adult. You're either at the start of adulthood or somewhere in the middle. So while in some ways all of the angst and storm and stress associated with adolescence has started to settle with this stage of life, it also has certain specific characteristics that contribute to a typical experience as well. Emerging adulthood tends to have a common experience, but in a different way. Now, even though this is a course on adolescence, I'm going to talk about emerging adulthood now because some of this does start at the tail end of adolescence, and part of this involves identity exploration. When a young person really starts to explore the possibilities available to them in a whole realm of ways regarding their personal relationships and friendships, and also what are they going to do for work? What are they going to do for education? And they're really kind of checking things out before they make a firm commitment to any of them. So a person at this stage of life is going to have all of these possibilities available to them, at least in Western societies. And they're going to either consider or try out and then consider the positives and negatives, the ups and downs, the pluses and minuses of them. Taking courses in a subject that you're interested in and then deciding if you want to take more. Or discovering that while you were always interested in that area, now that you've actually given it a try, it's not really what you thought it was. That's pretty common in the first couple of years of university. Teaching is a great example of this. It is very common for people to think they want to go into teaching and then discover after a few courses or even after a few placements once they've gone to teachers college that it isn't what they thought it was. In all seriousness, identity exploration also refers to an emerging adult's love life. When you date, what you're essentially doing is, in part, exploring your own identity with another person. Think about what you talk about on a date. What's your major? Why did you choose it? What others did you consider? Were there any subject areas you were particularly interested in, and you changed your mind? You're kind of trying that person on. You're seeing how well they fit with you. But at the same time, it's helping you figure things out for yourself. Interests, hobbies, favorite music or food or movies. Do you prefer cats or dogs? Do you want children? And if yes, when? Do you want to live in an urban or rural area? What is your compatibility level? Simply getting along with each other. And is the attraction or the spark you feel when you first meet, is that going to last 3 months? Or 6 months? Or 3 years? Have you ever dated somebody? Or have you known somebody who dated somebody and it starts out really well? There seems to have everything in common. But as the relationship progresses, you realize you're not a good fit. Have you ever dated someone and because of them you try a new sport or hobby or start listening to music you never had much interest in before? So all of this interacting with people dating, in part, helps you establish who you are as an individual. So during emerging adulthood, part of that involves identity exploration. And hopefully, as a result of this, it's going to result in a more definite identity for you as an adult, because you develop a more definite feeling and understanding of who you really are as a person. This might sound philosophical, but what you want out of life, how you want to spend your life, who you want to spend it with, where you want to spend it. You develop a more definite sense of what your own values are. For example, whether or not sex before marriage is okay. What role religion is going to play in your life as an adult. Now, another characteristic of emerging adulthood is instability. And to be honest, this sounds a lot more like my emerging adulthood and how I felt during the vast majority of it. Trying to figure out what I'm going to do after high school, whether that's college or university, learning a trade, vocational school, or beginning work right away. Now, maybe you're lucky and you're one of those people that knows for sure what they want to do, but you still have to decide where you want to do it. What school, what company? Do you live at home or in residence or in an apartment? Do you have roommates or live alone? Do you move at the beginning of the school year and move back home at the end of the school year, or do you stay there year round? Emerging adulthood is usually a time when there's a lot of choices to be made in a fairly short period of time. For people who didn't know for sure what they wanted to do during grade 12, for example, there's instability regarding relationships, friendships you've had since kindergarten that begin to dissolve, not because of an argument, but because you're each developing into adults with your own personalities becoming more solidified and you have less in common tying you together as friends. There's also instability regarding dating, relationships, who you spend your time with. Seeing someone you want more of a relationship with, but they don't feel the same way. Seeing someone you want more, who wants more of a relationship with you, but you don't feel the same way. Maybe a really intense relationship where you're both trying to keep it going and you bring up love a few weeks into it, and within 3 months it just burns itself out. Maybe wanting to have a relationship and not meeting anybody you like. There's instability maybe cohabiting with someone for a long period of time or for a short period of time. Then having to deal with the division of property. Who gets the DVDs? Who gets the cat? Who gets the couch you paid $25 for at the thrift store that you both want based on principle of the matter, not because either one of you particularly loves that couch? This is a time often going through a breakup with somebody. Maybe having an unpleasant roommate relationship with someone and having to move or wanting to move. No matter where you live, there's the adjustment of not living with family anymore, to being responsible for your own bills, being responsible for buying your own groceries and keeping all of this organized. As I often say to my son, there is no toilet paper fairy that magically makes it appear in the bathroom. There may be continued instability regarding your relationship with your parents because you're trying to become independent from them, and they continue to want to monitor what you're doing to a certain degree, and they want to continue to guide you to a certain degree. Now, it's estimated that about 50% of emerging adults in Canada and the States move back in with their parents at least once. And even in those countries, for example in Europe, where emerging adults tend to stay at home instead of moving out until marriage, they still have to go through the instability of their love life, their work, their education, and for many, a period of financial instability in emerging adulthood, which can be a huge issue. Emerging adulthood is also a self-focused period, and I don't mean this in a narcissistic, selfish way. It is typical and very normal at this stage of life to be self-focused, and to a certain degree, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Whether you're still living with your parents or living on your own, it's a time of life when you become more independent from your parents. So you're no longer as dependent on them, for example, for social contact. You're no longer as attached to them for your own identity because you're developing your own. You're developing your own understanding of things, whether it's something big or something small. Whether you're living with your parents or not, you're developing into an adult. You're making more and more of your own decisions, whether it is the courses you take, whether you attend class or not, who you date, how late you stay out at night, what you have for dinner. You become much more focused overall on yourself. So this self-focus is not just typical, it's okay. It's part of becoming an independent person separate from your family of origin. It's part of eventually developing into and then emerging as an adult. You could even say that being focused on your own self is healthy because you're learning to become self sufficient and stand on your own 2 feet. And as an emerging adult, we expect people to be focused on themselves, don't we? We expect them to be figuring out and focusing on all the examples I have given you, at least in Western societies. Now, another characteristic of the emerging adulthood stage is the feeling of being in between. You're no longer a child, but you're also not an adult, which can be difficult to navigate, not just for you, for your parents, because they know they need to let you grow up and make your own choices and sometimes your own mistakes because you're not an adult yet. But at the same time, you need to have those experiences. And if I was teaching this in class, I would ask people to raise their hand if they feel like they're not a competent adult yet. And when they do that, I raise my hand as well. You know, usually when you ask somebody who's in this period of their life, if they feel like they're an adult yet, they'll say, well, yeah, in some ways I do and in some ways I don't. But in all seriousness, I still feel that way, and I am middle-aged. I'm close to 50. And I still often feel like I'm not quite sure what I'm doing with my life, like I'm too unsettled, like I'm making the wrong decisions. It usually isn't until someone reaches their late 20s and maybe their 30s that they will say that they really start to feel like an adult. And what exactly makes a person feel this way will vary. It may be something big. I've found it tends to be small things. For most people, it isn't until they have completely finished all of their education, they've begun to work full-time at a job they plan or hope will be permanent, that they feel they've really reached adulthood. Often, it can boil down to a singular event that might seem terribly significant might not seem terribly significant in the grand scheme of things. Might not seem like a huge deal to those who are already adults, but to you, it is. Like I said, maybe working full time. Maybe for some people, it's buying a house or an apartment, or getting married, or having children. Maybe buying your first car and signing that loan agreement yourself. Signing your first lease agreement for a real apartment, not a crappy student apartment. Maybe having benefits in your own name and not having to rely on your parents. Maybe it's paying off your student loans. Maybe it's taking out a mortgage for a house. Maybe even getting married. Although I hate to tell you, but most engagements that start in the teens and early 20s usually end up not coming to fruition. Keep in mind, the average age at first marriage in Canada is 27 for women and 29 for men. I have a very, very distinct memory of being about 26, 27 and still in school, and I was grocery shopping. And I got really, really excited because fruit was on sale in the winter, which was unusual because it was off season. And I called my aunt when I got home and I told her I officially feel like an adult because I was excited about fruit being on sale. Another one for me was buying my own ironing board and iron because I knew that I'd need it for work. As an emerging adult, most people feel kind of caught in between at some point, like they're in transition. They live wherever they live, where they go to school, but a good chunk of the year is still spent in their hometown. So they feel kind of like an adult sometimes, but at the same time, they're still relying on their parents quite a bit and they're not quite sure. This feeling of being in between for emerging adults is not unique to North America. This is pretty universal across the globe, and it's totally, totally normal. However, the transition to being an adult, a full adult, in other countries can be explicitly marked by marriage. Now, yet another characteristic of an emerging adult is the feeling of possibility. a very, very optimistic outlook. So it's kind of like a two-sided sword. On one hand, you feel in between and unstable because you're not completely an adult, but you're not completely a kid anymore. And you have all this pressure to make decisions. But it also means you have the freedom to make decisions. You have decisions available to you to make. You have these range of possibilities. But having that much possibility can be overwhelming. It can be intimidating, and it can end up creating a lot of pressure. For example, did you feel overwhelmed either all the time or part of the time when you reached the end of high school having to decide what you would do afterwards? Maybe not just overwhelmed, but actually a bit scared, like what if I mess this up? So what was it that made you feel overwhelmed at the end of high school? What were some of the thoughts going through your head at that time? The amount of pressure it creates may inadvertently come from your family, the feeling that they expect really good things from you and that you need to live up to what they expect. Did you feel pressure from your family to make the right decision? It is because there are a lot of things about your life that haven't been decided for certain. You can make a lot of choices. Nothing has been set in stone yet. So you can try something out and decide you don't like it and switch. You can spend time with somebody and decide you don't want to see them anymore. You can keep changing your mind because you're not a full adult yet. This reminds me of marriage again. Like I said, the majority of long-term relationships in one's early 20s are not permanent. In this stage of life, you can keep changing your mind and explore possibilities. Now, this is also why this age bracket tends to be a time of a lot more optimism compared to an older age bracket. This is why college and university campuses tend to be places of a lot more social activism than in the general public. I get kind of optimistic just thinking about it because it's not unusual for people who are older to strongly advise emerging adults, to repeatedly advise emerging adults to take advantage of the possibilities they have available to them at that time. You have an opportunity to travel somewhere with friends? Go for it. You have an opportunity to go to another country for a semester? Go for it. You have the opportunity to go work in a remote location for a summer or a different city or anywhere else for 4 months? Well, go for it. Experience it. Another reason for more optimism at this age is because at this younger age, not necessarily for all, but most younger people have not had to deal with a lot of the stresses and problems typical of later ages. An unfulfilling job that you keep and head to day after day after day because you have bills to pay and a family to support. Maybe a divorce or the end of other important relationships. Maybe staying married, but the relationship is not what they always thought it would be. Maybe the death of loved ones or difficulties with children. If I were to ask people at the emerging adult stage what they expect of life as an adult, none of them would pick these things. None of them would envision any of this. Typically, a person who has not entered adulthood does not expect that their future will hold a lot of difficulties. But these are all pretty typical experiences in life. For example, in one national survey of 18 to 29-year-olds in the US, nearly 89% agreed with the statement, "I am confident I will eventually get what I want out of life." Now, that's very, very optimistic, and I don't mean to be sarcastic or mean when I say not very realistic either. So there's a noticeable difference regarding optimism in emerging adulthood. People have usually left their family of origin, or they're slowly but surely separating themselves from them, but at the same time they're not firmly committed to adult obligations. They're no longer, or at least less dependent on their family financially and emotionally. They may even move to a different area. They have the possibility of taking their life in whatever direction they want to. And A young person who comes from an unhappy home life for whatever reason can get out of there and get away from it. And a person who does come from a happy home can be their own person instead of primarily being identified in relation to their parents. So it's like a window of time during which the realm of possibilities seems infinite. Now, it's important to acknowledge the role of culture at this point and how it affects a person emerging as an adult. Because having all of this freedom or the space to go through this stage of life is only possible in those cultures in which putting off being a full adult is possible. It's only possible in those cultures in which a young person can put off being married and having children at least until their 20s. So in the US, Canada, Australia, most of Europe, Japan, for example, this is the norm. But it is generally only those cultures in which the economy is more developed, more integrated into a global economy, that this occurs. It is simply not as likely to be the situation in a traditional culture. So what this means then is that cultures vary quite a bit regarding the age that a young person is expected to enter full adulthood and take on adult responsibilities. And by that I mean work, marriage, children, maybe caring for parents or grandparents. And it may not seem like it, but our Western modernized way of doing things really is a relatively new approach to growing up. It's a pretty recent development in the overall course of history to live this stage of life in this manner. To becoming mature, that has been facilitated in part because people spend a lot longer in school than they ever did in the past, which has meant that people are getting married later and they're having children later. Because full adulthood has been postponed to roughly the mid to late 20s, it means that young people have more time to explore what being an adult is, everything I just went over. They can essentially delay being an adult. They can delay entering the real world, so to speak. Think about this. Graduating high school did not become the expected, typical cultural and social and educational norm in Canada and the US for the majority of young people until the 1960s. It wasn't until the 1960s that the term high school dropout even emerged, because prior to that, so many people did not graduate from high school, it was kind of the norm. But then once graduating high school became the norm, then a year or two of college became the norm, then a 3-year diploma, then more and more people began attending university and a 3-year degree was the norm, then a 4-year degree. Now a 4-year degree as well of postgraduate work is the norm, or at least very common. And one of the major side effects of this is essentially young people can put off being a full adult until a later age.